Good evening, Bayou Blitz family and Who Dat Nation. I am Bob Rose. I am one of your co-hosts to the Bayou Blitz podcast. As Brendan Boylan and I welcome you to another Wednesday night and what's been a rolls eyes now quiet week of Saints news. How are you tonight, Brendan?
I'm doing fine. That was a good way of putting that. Rolls eyes. Been all sorts of exciting. Even today, it's been it's been noisy. So we have a lot to get caught up on with everybody. Got to catch everybody up. I think between the two of us, we got to catch up ourselves too. It seems like every other second there's something new going on in New Orleans, and of course we have some big news. We'll get to that because 40% of our viewers voted for it on the poll to talk about, and that's the big trade. But we'll get to that. But Bob, before we get started, we were just talking about this off air. I just want to get this out of my system. Not even Saints related. So my girlfriend and I had stopped for dinner, trying to grab something quick before we got on the air. Stop at Taco Bell. I get a Baja Blast. And she said, "What's that?" And I looked at her and I said, "You've never had a Baja Blast before?" And she said, "No." So for all the people already here, if you follow me on Twitter, if you don't, just head to BT Boylan on Twitter, BTBOYLAN. I have a poll there. And please vote. Is it weird to have never had a Baja Blast? Bob and I both say yes. And my girlfriend says no, which makes sense. She's never had one before. But please go vote because it's – what was the comparison you used, Bob, with McDonald's?
I said to Brandon, I said, it's one thing if you've never eaten at Taco Bell, then I could understand you not having or maybe even hearing about a Baja Blast. But if you've eaten at Taco Bell, that's like saying you've eaten at McDonald's and you don't know what a Big Mac is. I love you, girl. I won't drop a name. I won't throw you under the bus unless Brendan does. I love you, girl, but it made me scratch my head. You got to have a Baja Blast.
Well, there we go. Guys, please vote. Now on to the Saints stuff, the more important stuff, other than the silly things going on in my life. So I want to start here. News that came across later this afternoon was that the Saints have released Dwayne Washington. Mm-hmm. Just want to go ahead and clarify for everybody from Dwayne Washington himself. He said he's not going anywhere via Twitter, that this is just a move for the Saints to clear some things up and him come back. So just to get that one out of the system, not that that's the biggest news of the day at all, but a guy that has been very valued on special teams, is a veteran, has proved at times he can run the football pretty well. He will be coming back to New Orleans, and you'll see a little bit of that. I mean, we've obviously seen some of that with the practice squad guys who got cut and brought back to the practice squad after they cleared waivers. One guy in particular that did not clear waivers. But, Bob, I know you have a list, whether it's in your head, whether it's on paper. I was trying to give you credit. You can't do that. We ruined it, all right, the Disney secret. But, no, we have notes. We're not that smart. But nonetheless, Bob, if you want to run through the many, many transactions that have happened with New Orleans this week, and particularly getting down to the initial 53-man roster, want to emphasize the word initial. There's never a final 53-man roster. It's always changing. This is the initial 53-man roster. Bob, who are some of the guys that got cut? Who are some of the guys that are coming back on the practice squad? And who got claimed by somebody else?
Well, first of all, to sort of hop on what Brendan was saying about Dwayne Washington, it was a little bit of a surprise to me that he made it in the first place. But I understand why he did. The Saints value special teams contributors as much as, or maybe more than most teams in the National Football League. But it's those positions that are extremely fluid, sometimes from week to week. During the regular season. But it did make me laugh, because the news is official that the Saints have released Dwayne Washington. But then when Washington immediately said, folks, Who Dat Nation, I'm not going anywhere. I kind of laughed, and just the last couple of days that I have had, and following this team and this team's news, it made me kind of chuckle to myself. I'm like, do we need to help Dennis Allen call security to get Dwayne Washington out of the building? But no, I mean, that's just an indicator that Washington is one of those players that we can expect to hear back and forth all year long, and there's a few of them on this New Orleans roster. First of all, to get everybody caught up on today's news, the Saints were very busy and filling out. What I have is 14 members of a 16-player practice squad. Two guys that are not going to be on that practice squad are Ian Book, quarterback, who was signed by the Philadelphia Eagles, and John Bostic, the linebacker, who was surprisingly, in my opinion, part of the cuts by New Orleans yesterday, re-signed with the team in Washington. I won't drop the R word anymore out of respect to some people, but I'm not going to. I know who they should be called. But anyway, John Bostic is back in Washington. So Ian Book, John Bostic are not part of the practice squad. To get you caught up on the practice squad members first, 3 wide receivers, Kirk Merritt, who was a surprise cut yesterday, in my opinion, to begin with, Dejon Dixon, and Rashid Shaheed. Linebackers, Nephi Sewell, Chase Hansen, and Eric Wilson, who also should have made the 53. Tight ends, Lucas Krull, J.P. Holtz. Defensive lineman, Jordan Jackson, and Taco Charlton. A little bit of surprise that he cleared waivers. Offensive lineman, Nick Martin, Josh Andrews. I mentioned linebackers to round out the practice squad, DeMarcus Fields and Vincent Gray. Brendan, did I miss anybody? I know you got a list too.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head with everybody at this point. I do want to talk about the 2 guys specifically that are not coming on to the practice squad that you mentioned that were picked up by opposing teams before we get to some of the guys that did make the practice squad that we expect to stick there and potentially be a guy that comes up and down on the roster as well. Let's start with Ian Book, a guy that a lot of people had some really strong opinions on after his so-so preseason. I said right here on the show, one of our first shows, that he was really impressing in camp. I think his last preseason game was his strongest. Still had moments where you could see that this is a young kid that is trying to find his way in the NFL, but a guy that I know that New Orleans wanted to bring back. New Orleans has been a team in years past that's kept 3 quarterbacks or 2 quarterbacks and 1 on the practice squad. So with Ian Book going to Philadelphia, he's clearly not competing to be a starter. That's Jalen Hurts' spot. But I've said continuously throughout Ian Book's tenure in New Orleans, he is a career backup with starter upside. How bad do you think it hurts New Orleans to not have Book coming back to this team?
It doesn't. And I don't mean that as any disrespect to Ian Book or what you said, because I agree with much of what you said. If Ian Book was going to be in New Orleans, whether it was as a 3rd-string quarterback or as a developmental practice squad guy, it was just that. As a developmental guy, in case they needed someone to turn to in extreme emergencies, and I outline extreme. Having said that, we saw what happens with the New Orleans Saints last year. They started 4 quarterbacks. Now, that's an anomaly, definitely an exception rather than a rule. But we know that injuries happen to players, including the quarterback position. But I looked at it this way. Even if Ian Book were on the roster, be it active or practice squad, if, God forbid, something happened to Jameis Winston or Andy Dalton, I am pretty convinced that the Saints would turn to Taysom Hill before they would turn to Ian Book. Because of the upside that Taysom Hill offers as an athlete, the experience over Ian Book that Taysom Hill has in the offense. Having said that, where it does sort of hurt New Orleans is even if only Winston or Dalton, knock on wood, go down, you still then need to have at least 1 backup present. So at that point, without Ian Book, they would probably have to, again, scrap the current plan for Taysom Hill, which is to develop at tight end and an athlete throughout the offense and move him back to the sidelines as a backup quarterback. So folks, do not be surprised. And again, we mentioned 14 names on the practice squad. There are 16 spots to be filled. Do not be surprised if the New Orleans Saints look to add a quarterback. It's not going to be a big name quarterback, but it might even be a veteran with some kind of starting experience in the league, just in case they have to turn to in an emergency.
It's going to kind of good segue to my next question, and that is, do you expect the Saints to find a third quarterback and stash him on the practice squad? You kind of answered that. What about a guy like C.J Costello, a guy that's been with New Orleans back-to-back off seasons, didn't make the roster? Could you see the Saints reaching out to him to be a member of the practice squad?
Yeah, I absolutely could. And when New Orleans signed him, there were a lot of fans that said, "Yeah, why would they do this? He's just an extra camp arm. It doesn't mean anything. It takes up the spot, a spot on the at the time 90-man training camp roster that they could use for another guy." And I replied, "Listen, the strategy is this: it's experience in the system." In a scenario like what we're looking at now, where the Saints decided Ian Book is not good enough at this stage of his career to use a spot on the active roster for him. I'm with you. I am convinced that they were hoping to bring him back to the practice squad. That didn't work out. So their just-in-case scenario is, C.J Costello, we're going to sign you. You're probably not going to make the team, or at least if you're being realistic, you have a very slim chance of doing so. But in being here, you've learned our playbook a little bit. You've learned your supporting cast, what will be your supporting cast a little bit. So just like I said with Ian Book, a guy like C.J Costello, while not an ideal situation by any stretch, he knows the offense and can be elevated from even a practice squad player, be elevated onto the sidelines like we saw with Blake Bortles last year. And in the case of Blake, they signed him 2 days before Ian Book had that emergency start against Miami, because of COVID. That's a situation that the Saints want to avoid. C.J Costello, a guy like C.J Costello, knows the system a little bit. A guy like Ryan Griffin, who was just released by Tampa Bay, he knows the system a little bit. None of those situations are ideal, but if you're turning to a third, fourth, fifth-string quarterback, as we saw last year, your season is in a whole lot of trouble anyway. You want to at least give yourself a fighting chance by plugging in a guy who knows your playbook even a tiny bit.
And going to the other guy that will not be brought on the practice squad or finding his way to the 53-man, and Jon Bostic going back to Washington, impressed a lot of people during a short stint in Saints training camp. Not a lot of holes on the Saints team. I think that's safe to say. However, there's a lot of questions when it comes to depth at linebacker. Are you surprised Bostic didn't make the initial 53? And are you disappointed that New Orleans didn't make a big move in filling some of that depth concern at linebacker?
Yes and yes. I am surprised and disappointed that Bostic and Eric Wilson did not make the final roster. I had them pegged both to make the initial 53, but at the very least, I figured one of them would. Bostic, as you pointed out, it was a late signing to camp. But it looked like he was picking up the defense pretty well. Eric Wilson, on the other hand, I thought had an outstanding preseason. Was very strong in coverage, especially throughout training camp. Both of those guys were released yesterday. Bostic goes back to Washington, but at least they brought Wilson back onto the practice squad. So that's kind of a little bit of solace, because this position still does extremely concern me. The release, and I said it yesterday too, the release of Wilson and Bostic at least tells us that Pete Werner's health is coming along nicely. That's good news. But the bad news is, you keep Zach Bond over these guys. You keep Andrew Dowell over these guys. Now, Dowell knows the system. I guess Bond knows the system too. But Dowell has at least proven he could take snaps in this defense. Bond has proven that to absolutely nobody. And again, just like with Dwayne Washington, I understand the special teams value, but at some point you have to make, in my opinion, you have to make decisions that are going to bolster the depth of a particular position on your roster. And in my opinion, and I'm not Dennis Allen. I'll never be Dennis Allen. Dennis Allen gets paid the big bucks to make these decisions, and there's a reason he does so. But just as an outsider's point of view, I don't see how keeping Bond over Eric Wilson or Jon Bostic helps the team at the position of linebacker. That's just my opinion, the way I see it.
Well, let's keep it rolling with decisions that you weren't a huge fan of in terms of guys that stuck to the 53-man roster.
I know what's coming now.
It came in on the chat from our loyal listeners and watchers. So, of course, Bob, it's not to sit here and antagonize you or get a little bit of an angry Bob out. It's because of our great fans that come in and week out. And though you don't believe me, I'll throw it up there. Thanks, Donald. You are definitely helping this conversation. Traquan Smith makes the team. Lots of people not super thrilled by that. The Saints did keep 3 receivers on the practice squad. Kirk Merritt was an interesting one because he started getting some time at running back. And the great Aaron Summers, who's initially from right here in North Carolina, got a chance to work with her a little bit with ESPN before she took the Saints job. For you people in New Orleans, you got a wonderful, wonderful reporter for NewOrleansSaints.com. Aaron is top notch. But she reported during the game against the Chargers that Marquez Callaway was actually the one that spoke up and said they were showing some high school film of some of these players to the coaching staff. And that's when the Saints coaching staff found out Merritt played running back in high school. At that point, the running back room scooped him up, and Marquez Callaway said that was one of the worst decisions they could make because from that point on, they knew they weren't going to see him again. But Merritt, I think, could potentially play that like Ty Montgomery type of role. I really like Ty Montgomery in his time in New Orleans. I wrote a piece when they first signed him that he was a perfect fit for Sean Payton. But nonetheless, Dixon had a good offseason, a good camp. I know our own Kyle T. Mosley spoke with him a few times this offseason. But we talked about it, Bob, you and I. This is episode 7 of the Bayou Blitz reboot. So almost 2 months we talked about how the Saints were only going to keep 5 or 6 receivers. They do just that, and Traquan is one of those guys. Your thoughts?
Well, first, I've said all offseason that I believed, as rare as it happened, I still believed that the Saints would carry 6 wide receivers. I was right about that. But I've also said all offseason that among those 6, Deontay Hardy, Marquez Callaway, and Traquan Smith will not all 3 be among those 6. At least for the time being, I was wrong about that. Deontay, I didn't see much of an issue with because he's one of the most dangerous return men in football, and he's a vastly underrated route runner. So I couldn't see the team moving on from him, barring a surprise. Callaway far outplayed Traquan Smith throughout training camp and all 3 preseason games. And Callaway adds brings the added bonus of a special teams contributor, be it as a gunner on coverage, or he could fill in very adequately as a punt returner when asked. We've seen that. I thought Kirk Merritt or Dejon Dixon would get that 6th spot, a developmental guy that you can move back and forth from the practice squad, or make game day, active or inactive all year long. So, that 6th spot was always going to be a fluid position for me. That's why I figured it would be a developmental guy. As you said, Brendan, Dejon Dixon got off to a strong start to training camp and then sort of tailed off. When he tailed off, Kirk Merritt, who got off to a solid start, don't get me wrong, but Kirk Merritt came on like gangbusters at the end. Merritt, even more so than Dixon, but definitely more so than Traquan Smith, can also play special teams. And they were tinkering, as you mentioned, Brendan, with position versatility. All those reasons are why I figured Kirk Merritt would get the spot over Traquan Smith. And I didn't think that they would necessarily outright cut Smith, or for that matter, even Callaway or Hardy if it came down to that. I thought that it would be a possibility that they would try to move one of them via trade. And while that's still possible, we've not heard anything concrete, anything more than speculation. So, it shocks and frankly disappoints me that Traquan Smith has made this team yet again. I understand they love his blocking. He does have experience in the system, folks, so you cannot undervalue that. That's a valuable asset. But as I've said on these shows, in my articles, in other interviews, I don't know what Traquan Smith brings. And no, I do know what Traquan Smith brings to this team as a wide receiver, and it's not much. Just like I asked the question with Zach Bond, I don't see how Traquan Smith improves your wide receiver position.
I was going to get to just that. I mean, I was pretty high on Trey when he came out in the draft and what he could bring at that time to the Saints offense and stretching the field. We saw flashes of it against Washington when Drew broke the record. Saw a flash of it that same year against another NFC East foe in Philadelphia, where he had an 100-yard day and I believe a pair of touchdowns as well. And he's had some moments, maybe not in a complete game, but he's had moments. You look at the shootout against San Francisco a few years ago where he takes the ball from across the middle, breaks some tackles, gets in the end zone, Saints up with less than a minute left. He's had moments, but he's a pretty average run-of-the-mill receiver. Would probably be a 4th, 5th receiver on just about any team in the league. However, with the Saints team that has more depth at receiver than ever, I'm with Bob. I'm a little surprised to not see that last spot occupied by a developmental piece. And I still wouldn't be surprised if New Orleans traded him, if they can get anything for him.
Right.
Obviously there's a little bit of a market, and you were able to see with what the Eagles did today in trading a receiver. You can kind of get some similar comp and understand what you might get for Trey Quan. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a team interested, right? And that's going to be the interesting thing. So with that, and talking about teams and interests and trades before we get to the rest of the 53-man and the practice squad, let's talk about what you guys wanted us to talk about, according to the Twitter poll, and that is the trade of C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, C.D. Deuce, however you know him. He is no longer a New Orleans Saint. He gets traded to the Philadelphia Eagles. And before we get into the details of it, I do want to address these things. Gardner-Johnson made it clear he wanted a new contract. He did not sit out of or hold out of training camp, but he was very vocal in limiting his availability for certain parts of it, which was a little odd to not have a full holdout, but a partial holdout. Multiple reports, including Nick Underhill, including our very own John Hendricks, that there started becoming issues with Gardner-Johnson's attitude during this process. And ultimately, New Orleans decides to move on, considering the depth they have at that position as well. You look at Alontae Taylor, who's impressed. I know we got a little picked up today, but he's impressed. PJ Williams doesn't get enough credit. We talked about that a lot last year in our pregame and halftime shows, that he impressed a lot of people. And the fact that he didn't get a multi-year deal this offseason is still a head scratcher to me, because I thought he actually deserved it. And he's found a nice little home in this cornerback safety role that he continues to play. Nonetheless, the Saints move on from Gardner-Johnson. With that said, a lot of people were shocked to see the compensation back, which you could argue was little. This will be my argument. Just like I said with Trey Quan, there has to be a market. And believe it or not, folks, the NFL and GMs and presidents of teams and these guys working the phones, this isn't like Madden where you can just hit a button and receive 20 offers at one time and just pick the best. As much as I would like to say it's that way, it's not. You have to work the phones and see what's available. And if we've learned anything about Mickey Loomis and the front office for New Orleans, there are no stones left unturned ever. Whether that's contract negotiations, whether that's trade negotiations, whether that's draft day, New Orleans does their homework. And if I was a betting man, I would tell you that this was the best offer on the table for Gardner-Johnson, because the Saints wouldn't have accepted anything less. So though the compensation doesn't seem great, I think that's the only way you can look at it rationally, is that this is the best offer on the table. The Saints could have easily kept him throughout the season and just played out the rest of his contract, got nothing, in free agency, maybe a comp pick. But if there was truly issues with his attitude and the team, I can understand why the move was made. While we're on this topic, let's take it to some of our questions. Do you agree the Saints should have traded for an offensive lineman to the future draft picks? I think that goes to exactly what I just said. I mean, what was on the table? And I think if the Saints really had some questions and want to get some depth at O-line and it was on the table, they would have taken it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the picks are what they got, and you never know what picks become. You know, you see a lot of gems over the years. I mean, especially in New Orleans, you look at how many gems they've drafted late round over the years, or package picks to trade up and grab a guy like Alvin Kamara, package picks, trade back in. He hasn't really panned out, but we've just a recent example, another guy in Adam Troutman where they packaged picks, traded back in, and went and got a guy. So, yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that. See, still think the roster is complete. I think it is a very good roster. It's one of the better rosters that this team has put together over the last few years. And then finally, Gardner-Johnson seemed to turn immature, and it was a good move. Like I said, you know, I have a lot of faith in our very own John Hendricks. There's a lot of respect for what Nick Underhill does as well in his reporting. And listen, those are like the top two guys on Saints Twitter. I think if both those guys are telling me and you the same thing, and one of them's in my ear every day, and John Hendricks, I'm going to take their word for it. And I think Gardner-Johnson did start becoming an issue. I found it interesting, Bob, before we get your thoughts, and we can kind of start here. Typically when a guy gets traded in today's modern world, you and I were talking about it before we got on, with how technology is advanced, and we wouldn't be able to do this 10 years ago with us being in different states and whatnot. We talked about social media at the beginning of the show and how I'm able to just throw a poll out to thousands of people. Is it not a little odd to see that, at least from what I see, not a single member of the New Orleans Saints had a tweet towards Gardner-Johnson like, go get him in Philly, or go get the money? Is that just a little odd to you?
Yeah, that did strike me as odd. And yeah, that was one of the first things that I noticed social media wise. Cam Jordan and I think Tyrann Mathieu, posted something on Gardner-Johnson's Instagram page that leaked its way over to Twitter. But it was a very general, goodbye, good luck, miss you, kind of thing. But unlike what we have seen with other teams, other players from the Saints, if they're released, retired, traded, anything like that, there wasn't this outpouring from the locker room, and that doesn't mean that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was a bad guy. It doesn't mean he was a bad teammate. I think it's very noteworthy in this day and age, what we didn't see out of the Saints locker room. And listen, as a player, I've always liked Chauncey Gardner-Johnson all the way back in his University of Florida days. I remember doing a draft piece on him when he came out in 2019. And actually in one of my mock drafts, one of the handful of picks that I've got correct for the Saints over the years, I had the Saints picking him. But I had them picking him in the second round because that's where his value was. The reason he dropped, ladies and gentlemen, and I wrote this at the time, locker room and character concerns. Now, they were very general character concerns. He didn't have any problems with the law, nothing that really stuck out, as red flags. It wasn't a collegiate version at the time of what Antonio Brown is. And has been for years in the NFL. So nothing like that. But when a guy drops, it does make you wonder, does he get along with coaches? Does he get along with teammates? Are there issues there? And even though we didn't hear anything concrete, the fact that he dropped tells us that the other 32 teams maybe did hear something or maybe did see something in their draft interviews. And I mean, hindsight is 2020. Lord knows that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson had a very, very good career for his 3 seasons in New Orleans. But when that attitude started to rear its head, he was obviously discontent with his contract. And the current social term is, I believe, holding in. All that tells me is that you're dragging ass on the job. Well, when your job is not paying you your worth or what you feel your worth is, granted, you have a a valid complaint, but therein lies the rub. Your job isn't giving you the money or maybe the treatment that you feel that you deserve, so you do worse at that job. Tell me how that makes any sense and how that's supposed to come to a rational solution. And it's not the assistant coach's fault that he didn't get paid. It's not his teammates' fault that he didn't get paid. So screaming at him in practice, or ceasing to take coach's instructions, or intentionally and obviously dogging it during certain drills or matchups, that to me bought his ticket straight out of New Orleans. And I understand he was a fan favorite, and I understand why. But the other, and we were hearing reports, it started with Jeff Duncan and has trickled since, that C.J Gardner-Johnson and his representatives against the New Orleans Saints were as much as $4 million apart per year. And the average social media fan was saying, well, the Saints can pay that. They have X amount of cap space this year. Yeah, this year. They're already 62 or 63 million in the red next year that they're going to have to do all kinds of personnel juggling again. This contract extension for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, wherever and whenever it happens, is going to be a multi-year extension. And he's going to be paid well, and he probably deserves it. But it was never going to come for the New Orleans Saints. A couple reasons for that. Brendan and I have already said our piece about him acting out on the field. There's no need to beat a dead horse with that. We've said it. It's a reason why he's not here anymore, but it's not the only reason. The end of his contract isn't the only reason. The Saints have other players to address, other free agents to address. Eric McCoy, Marcus Davenport are two huge names. If Jameis Winston plays well this year, the Saints are going to have to pony up and give him a hefty contract raise next year, or risk an ugly situation there. They're going to be bringing in new players. Other current players are going to have contracts that are inflating with each year of that passing contract. It's these kind of situations. When you kick the salary cap can down the road, you have to make these tough personnel decisions every now and then. And if you're going to move Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, now is the time to move him. You look at the talent that the Saints have in the secondary. This is still probably, even without him, this is still probably the best defensive backfield from top to bottom in the National Football League. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is not better than Marshawn Lattimore. He's not better than Paulson Adebo. He's a very good player, but he's not the pure safety that they wanted out of Tyrann Mathieu or Marcus May. You have Alontae Taylor coming in, so Gardner-Johnson's absence now opens the door for him. You have Bradley Roby, who is going to get a lot more snaps now. And remember, this is an experienced NFL starter who could still be a top 2 cornerback for many teams throughout the National Football League. You have P.J. Williams, as you mentioned. You have Justin Evans, who absolutely balled out in training camp and is playing and looking like the starter that he was in 2017 and 2018 with Tampa Bay. It's for those reasons. Evans is healthy and balling out. They have those other these other players that we mentioned, and this is not to be discounted. Remember, Marcus May's DUI hearing got pushed back again until November, which means May, just like Alvin Kamara, now faces a decreased, it's not off the table, but a decreased likelihood of suspension in 2022. So you have Evans balling out. May is going to be available. Alontae Taylor is coming back healthy. And even though Paulson Adebo is nicked up, we're hearing he's going to be available for week 1. I think that's 50-50 right now at best. It's for all those reasons that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson became a tradable asset. And I understand. I'm unhappy too, Saints fans. I'm unhappy at the compensation too. But you look at who they traded him to. They traded him to a fellow NFC playoff contender, and one who is on your schedule this year. You know what that tells me? That tells me that there wasn't a huge trade market for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. When you trade a volatile player like this, a talented player like this, ideally, you're going to trade him outside of your division. But ideally, you want to trade him either outside of your conference or to a team that you're not going to immediately be facing. Neither of those two things happened. I'm convinced now, the more I think about it, I'm still disappointed at the compensation, but I'm just as convinced that the Saints got what they could for C.J Gardner-Johnson, a player who they were afraid they weren't going to get 100% effort out of this season in a very deep and talented defensive backfield and facing a contractual situation where they're going to have to deal with other big name, more valuable players to their team in 2023. That's as nutshell as I can make it.
Great analysis, Bob. I think you hit the nail on the head with the talent there, along with the other things, made him an expendable piece. And New Orleans got what they could for it. I'm glad you brought that up in trade, wanting 9 times out of 10 when you have an asset to a team like that, you want to trade him out of your division, out of your conference. It says a lot that he was traded within the division to a team, like you said, that contends for a playoff spot and will play New Orleans this year. I also want to touch, I'm glad you said Bradley Roby, a guy that we're guilty too of not giving him enough props this offseason. He's kind of a guy that's slid under the rug a little bit. But nonetheless, he becomes a luxury at this point. In New Orleans, a guy that a lot of people at the beginning of the season and the offseason was saying, well, this is a guy who could be a surprising roster cut. It might be a guy New Orleans could trade. And now he is a luxury for this team, especially if Taylor or Marshawn Lattimore go down. But I think we've covered everything when it comes to Gardner-Johnson. The last thing that I will say, it's might be a stretch of a comparison for what we were saying with the social media age, but it's the last shocking move I remember for New Orleans, and this was a much bigger shock. But when Jimmy Graham was traded, Twitter was not super old. It wasn't young, but it's not the Twitter that we know today.
Right.
There was more Twitter buzz from players on Jimmy Graham being traded, given superstar, best tight end in football at that point. Right, there was more buzz around that than Gardner-Johnson leaving.
Yeah,
that's how.
Yeah, and the Graham trade surprised me a lot more than Gardner-Johnson did. When I asked yesterday, if I was surprised that the Saints traded Gardner-Johnson, I immediately answered no. I wasn't surprised, and I outlined all the reasons before. I wouldn't have predicted it personally, but I wasn't surprised. With Jimmy Graham, I think all of us were blindsided by it. We didn't see it coming. After we heard what we heard about Graham after the fact, we should have seen it coming. But like you said, Brendan, there wasn't the Twitter leaks, that there are today. But with Gardner-Johnson, it was a lot different situation, a lot stronger reaction from the players in the Jimmy Graham trade than there was Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. And again, I don't think that says he's a bad guy. I don't think that says he was an unpopular teammate. We know, and we've called him the emotional or one of the emotional catalysts of this defensive unit. But don't think that this unit is going to lack for intensity either. You mean to tell me that Cam Jordan isn't going to still be an intense player? Demario Davis isn't still going to be an intense player? Marshawn Lattimore, Tyrann Mathieu, those guys are all highly emotional play. You're still talking about a very a strong emotional leadership. With a lot of young guys like Alontae Taylor, guys, trust me, I watched enough film on this kid after they drafted him. Just in trying to get to know the player itself. This guy plays with an edge that's going to remind you of a certain departed number 22. The Saints secondary, the Saints defense is still going to play with an edge. Trust me.
Absolutely. Well, let's get to some of the guys that made the team. Some of the guys on the practice squad. Some guys that we're happy to see either back in New Orleans or getting their shot with the New Orleans Saints. I also want to talk about this because you said number 22. Is Mark Ingram going to go back to 22?
I hope so.
He should, right?
Yeah,
We're all in
yeah.
agreement?
He looks weird in number 5. He just does.
He looked weird in 14.
Oh,
He
yeah.
looked really weird in 14. Chat, I want to know, as we continue on the conversation, just drop it real quick. Should Mark Ingram go back to 22? Because I think he should. Anyway, when we go on to players that made the team, guys that were happy that made the team, or guys that were happy made the practice squad, I think we're both in agreement with a guy like Kirk Merritt because he's just super interesting. In what he could become in the Saints offense. Obviously, it's a little weird because you can't say the Sean Payton offense anymore. But Pete Carmichael has been a mastermind for New Orleans for the better part of a decade and a half. And I still think that he's going to find some good use for a guy like Merritt, and being able to stash him on the practice squad is a really, really good thing. I guess I'll start here. You already brought him up. I'm really happy to see Justin Evans get a chance. Anytime you see a guy go through injury like that and back-to-back years with season-ending injuries like that, I'm really happy to see him on the roster. I think New Orleans got a potential steal.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you have injuries like that and Achilles, it's tough to say you're ever back to 100%, even at a young age. And you might not get the guy that looked like a borderline Pro Bowl guy, but you're going to get a guy who's going to contribute, and a guy that has the heart and the want to not just make the team, but stick on the team and stick in the league. And I think anytime that a guy gets a shot like that, he shows a lot of gratitude towards the team that gave him that opportunity. Yeah. And he's already expressed some of that on social media. I think that Evans is my number one, happy the dude made the team type of guy. And when it comes to the practice squad, I think we're both in agreement with a guy like Kirk Merritt. I'm really curious to see what they'll do with those last two spots. But Bob, who's a guy on the practice squad you're happy to see make it? Who's a guy on the regular roster that you're happy to see make it?
I'll go. Well, you know I'm a fan of Justin Evans. He was a dark horse favorite of mine since the day they signed him, this spring. And I'm with you on Merritt. But instead of piggybacking with you, I'll try to go a different direction, and I'll start defensively. Eric Wilson, I'm thrilled they brought him back to the practice squad. I still believe that at some point he'll be elevated to the active roster. I think he just adds too much value to the defense, especially as a coverage linebacker. He's a starting quality linebacker. And I understand most alignments, Dennis Allen, Chris Richard, and Ryan Nielsen, they're going to prefer to run with two linebackers, ideally being DeMario and Pete Werner. But Eric Wilson is perfectly athletically capable of taking on that role. If Werner were to get a little bit dinged up or DeMario were to need a breather. I think that Eric Wilson is going to add value to this team at some point. Offensively is tough. Because again, I don't want to piggyback on Merritt. I'm interested to see what a guy like Juwan Johnson is going to bring to this offense this year. Juwan bulked up. I've said it repeatedly, and I understand the contention was that Adam Troutman had a strong training camp, and everything that I have seen has backed that up. So we keep our fingers crossed. He's going to be your starter. When people talk about Taysom Hill, what he's going to bring at tight end, or I'm mentioning Juwan Johnson now, those are going to be in different roles. Juwan is the best pure pass catcher, best pure receiver out of the tight end group. And the fact that he was a very good blocker at the receiver position, but he struggled as an inline blocker when they moved him to tight end last year. Now he has a full year under his belt to learn the position. He's bulked up. He has a nice chemistry with Jameis Winston. And not enough people are talking about that. But we saw that last preseason and early in the year last season before Jameis went down. So, I think Juwan Johnson could be a sneaky contributor. I'm not talking Pro Bowl numbers. I'm not talking the next reincarnation of Jimmy Graham or anything like that. But I'm talking about a guy who might be able to give you 25 to 30 big key receptions during the course of the year. And anything you get, as far as I'm concerned, whether it's Troutman, Taysom, Juwan, anything you get out of that tight end position is going to be gravy after what we saw out of that putrid bunch last year.
Absolutely. Juwan Johnson's a really interesting guy. And one of my favorite stories last season was Juwan Johnson's story that he told of almost quitting football. Yeah. Because he was asked to play tight end. And he always said that everything kind of comes full circle, and that's how he's going to get a shot in the NFL. So hopefully we see some more touchdowns. I think that the tight end position is going to be really interesting with Johnson and Troutman in the red zone because over the years, New Orleans, outside of Mike Thomas, haven't had really big receivers to go to in the end zone. Right. Having two big tight ends could be just the recipe for success. And of course, not Michael Thomas hate by any means, but it's a guy who's never had double-digit touchdowns before, and that's just because of the attention he attracts. So maybe whether it's the tight ends getting some of that attention off of Mike Thomas or Mike Thomas's attention opening it up for the tight ends, that'll be really interesting to see. I want to take this question, two questions. First from our friend Gypsy. Penning out indefinitely. Cesar Ruiz, a question mark. Is there anything on the table for a trade for a veteran offensive lineman? Bob, I'll let you answer it. But I think my first response to that would be, why would you not be okay? Or my follow-up question is, why would you not be okay with what New Orleans has in terms of offensive line right now, considering they're outside of Penning, they're pretty healthy?
Right, but that outside of Penning is a big outside. Because James Hurst is going to be a good offensive, a good left tackle, folks. I'm not worried about that starting five at all. Cesar Ruiz, of course, is a question mark. Because we're all waiting to see how he develops, if he develops. But that was going to be a question mark going in anyway. Cesar Ruiz was going to be the starter. There was no question. But with Trevor Penning's injury, you not only, in my opinion, you affect two positions on the offensive line. You affect, obviously, the left tackle spot, which is what he was being groomed for, but you also affect each of the guard spots because as good as James Hurst will be as a tackle, he's actually better suited as a guard. If Penning would eventually have taken over the left tackle spot or had been able to fill in there if there would have been an injury inside, we're looking at you, Andres Pete, forcing James Hurst to slide. Tell me I'm wrong. Forcing James Hurst to move inside. So now you don't have that flexibility there. Calvin Throckmorton, a player both Brendan and I are fans of. Throck can fill in at that guard spot, but what do you have behind him? You have Landon Young as your backup tackle now. The coaches love Young, and I understand why. He has good feet. He's a fluid athlete for such a big man, but he's wildly inconsistent. He's still a very, very young player. And outside of that, you got nobody. They kept Lewis Kidd, an undrafted rookie, and I'm looking for the name. They brought in and signed to the active roster Tanner Owen, who was released by the Buffalo Bills. I've not done any research on him yet, but he was a guy on a waiver wire. That's all you need to know. I do explore maybe a trade, but it's not going to be a splashy move. It's not going to be for a guy like Isaiah Wynn of the Patriots, or any top tier starter. The Saints don't need that. What they can do, rather than explain, and trade is certainly a possibility. I don't discount that. I think they'll explore the waiver wire. And look to bring in a guy, a young veteran, or some kind of veteran with starting experience, because you can bring in a young guy off the street and keep your fingers crossed and hope that he works out. But you already have that with the guy Owen, the kid they just signed from Buffalo. You already have that with Kidd, and to some extent, you already have that with Young. I think that there are viable veteran options on the waiver wire where you wouldn't necessarily have to give up a trade commodity to bring in. Does the backup offensive line need bolstering? Yeah, in my opinion, I think it does, at least until Penning gets healthy. Yeah, but I don't think you need to. Don't think you need to pursue a top tier starter and give up valuable assets that could affect your future.
Good analysis. Another question. Do you think we sign Butler at defensive tackle? We need some depth. If not, who do we sign? That's an interesting spot, and Bob and I have talked about it a lot this year. In the last couple months, in particular, it's a spot that has question marks, but there's a lot of promise as well. Now, with Malcolm Roach going to injured reserve, I think there's a little bit more of a question mark and a little bit less young promise. But bringing a guy like Butler in, bringing a guy like Brown back might be interesting. I think there's a lot of options for New Orleans because outside of David Onyemata, you have some guys with NFL experience, but nobody that really stands out. I know that you've been a big fan of Passanio, who can play inside-outside. Taco Charlton comes back, another guy who can play inside-outside. And, of course, underrated signing this offseason by New Orleans was grabbing the guy who famously injured Drew Brees and broke some ribs. That's a guy that I think will also go undervalued perhaps by the fan base, but will provide a lot of nice depth and snaps rotationally inside. Bob, do you agree? And if not, or if so, should the Saints go grab another defensive tackle?
I'll start with the last question first. I think what the Saints are going to do is look to see what the pieces they currently have, how they perform, before they pursue a veteran free agent. But they know what they could have in Malcolm Butler if he would be available. They brought in a guy like Vernon Butler in for a tryout to see what. They're kind of kicking the can on that one to see what he has. In case they need to turn to him, and they've tried out Ndamukong Suh a few times, who's still on the waiver wire too. They're exploring potential options, but I don't think they pull the trigger on anybody, barring injury. I don't think they pull the trigger on anybody if who they have there plays well in the first few weeks, and who they have. You mentioned Big O, Onyemata, and I think we all expect a big bounce back from him. Shy Tuttle is as good a run stuffer as there is in the league. It doesn't give you much as a pass rusher, but you don't need to. If he could just tie up blockers, you have an edge rushing position as deep as any in the National Football League. You mentioned Passanio, and I found it interesting that Passanio got a lot of snaps at defensive tackle, this preseason. And we know that he slid inside effectively for the Saints last year. Peyton Turner, Marcus Davenport, even Cam Jordan all logged some some interior rusher snaps and obvious pass situations in the last year. So they do have some flexibility because of those versatile defensive ends. And I do expect a big season from Kentavious Street, the guy that they picked up from the 49ers. The Saints have had key underrated signings for, I got to believe it's for the last 8 years. Along their defensive line. We saw it in Nick Fairley. We saw it in Mario Edwards, Malcolm Brown, who you mentioned. Passanio was that key underrated pickup last year. I think Kentavious Street can give them that kind of contribution that those other guys did, and just kind of give a boost to a defensive tackle position that we really didn't see a whole lot out of last year. Not too much was made of that because of the disruption the Saints got up front, because of the defensive ends and their versatility and just raw skill. But we're going to need to see more from that this year. But I don't think the Saints bring in a defensive tackle right away because, like I said, I believe that they like the pieces that they have there. Otherwise, we would have seen a move before. If those guys struggle, or if, knock on wood, there's another injury at the position, a whole different story. But I think they're good with status quo as we see it now.
Well, let's stick with the defense. And we've talked about linebacker depth being an issue. Brian wants to know, Pete Werner, what's his status going into week one? I believe it's still a question mark unless you have some other information, Bob.
It's still a question mark until it's not. I know that's a Sean Payton answer. It is. Payton's in my blood after 16 years. What can I say? The good news is Werner's back at practice. The better news is, and Brendan and I touched on it at the beginning of the show, the fact that the Saints were comfortable enough to release two experienced starters in John Bostic and Eric Wilson, even though they brought Wilson back, that tells us that they believe that Pete Werner is well on the road to being ready. In interviews with both Werner and Dennis Allen, it didn't sound to me like if they had to play the Falcons this Sunday that Werner would be a go. But it sounded, the report sounded very encouraging, like he was on the right track. So I believe, and my answer is going to be a tentatively, yeah. I think we'll see Pete Werner in week 1, but we honestly probably won't know anything more certain, than that 50-50 answer until next Wednesday. Coincidentally enough, on the Bayou Blitz.
Yeah, injury reports soon. Real football soon. And with the last 5 minutes, I want to talk about real football just a little bit. Obviously, September 11th, the New Orleans Saints will be in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, not Mercedes-Benz Superdome. Still getting used to saying that, but Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia, to take on the bitter rival, the Atlanta Falcons. Bob, this is going to be the first regular season game for Tyrann Mathieu and Jarvis Landry with their hometown teams. Both those guys, big splash pickups in the offseason. Landry's had his moments in training camp, and though we haven't seen a whole lot on the field from Tyrann Mathieu, we know exactly the type of player that he is. Looking at those two guys in particularly, what kind of pressure do you feel like those guys are going to have on their shoulders the first couple of weeks, knowing, and maybe particularly week 2, their first game in New Orleans as a member of the Saints?
I think week 2 is going to be the more pressure-packed one for the entire team, because that's going to be the better barometer of where the Saints truly are in terms of whether they're an early season contender or not. Week 1, even with veterans, Brendan and I know a bunch of former Saints players that have all said, that first game of the regular season, it gave them playoff like postseason like butterflies. No matter how many times, no matter how many years you're in the league, playing with a new team, I would think would increase those butterflies a little bit. I believe that the bigger pressure is on Tyrann Mathieu than it is Jarvis Landry, because Mathieu, wide receiver is a high profile position, yes, but the Saints have so much other talent there, and while we've outlined the talent that the Saints have in the secondary, it starts with Tyrann Mathieu and Marcus May. I've mentioned concerns about the cohesiveness and the chemistry between the safeties and the corners, and that being my biggest concern for this defense right now. That obviously that starts with Mathieu and May. How well, and Atlanta is not going to have an offense that's going to burn up the league or anything like that, but they do have weapons. They do have young athletic weapons. So I see a guy like Mathieu being tested early and often, and all eyes are going to be on all these new guys, Brendan, like you said. But I think it's more important for the New Orleans Saints for Tyrann Mathieu to play well than it is Jarvis Landry.
I would tend to agree with you. I think, however, first touchdown for Jarvis Landry, a lot of monkey off the back.
Oh, yeah.
First big play. Doesn't have to be an interception. Doesn't have to be a fumble recovery, forced fumble. First big play for Tyrann Mathieu. I think there's a lot of pressure that comes off. There's going to be pressure in the Superdome, your first game in the Dome, being hometown kids. But if they're able to make the big play, big third down catch for Jarvis, a big hit from Tyrann Mathieu, pass breakup early, crowd gets rocking, and a lot of those butterflies start going away, right?
Yeah, and we've seen in recent years, we've heard players on both teams mention this too. That Saints fans travel well in general. They travel really well to Atlanta to watch a Falcons Saints games. And I've made note of the fact that the last 3 or 4 years, that a number of Saints players happily and a number of Falcons players angrily pointed out that it seemed like more of a home game for the New Orleans Saints than it did the Atlanta Falcons.
As someone who lived in the Atlanta area before I started covering the team, I can confirm that even those years, the early 2010s, it's been that way for a long time. Saints fans have always traveled extremely well to what was then the Georgia Dome and, of course, now Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Well, Bob, that's all the time we have for this week's edition of the Bayou Blitz podcast. Where can everybody follow you on the World Wide Web? Because I think everybody already does. I don't think we need to really throw it out there anymore. Bob's one of the best followers on Twitter. And, of course, if you're in the Bayou Blitz Facebook group, you're probably already friends with Bob Rose on Facebook.
Well, Brendan just said it all for me. But folks, you can follow me, Bob Rose on Facebook, at BobbyR2613 on Twitter. Obviously, and as always, my work, all of our works, can be found through the Saints News Network on Facebook, at Saints News on Twitter, and obviously we continue to do all the team coverage for the New Orleans Saints on the SI.com team page. Brendan mentioned the Facebook group Bayou Blitz. There is a Twitter page as well, so make sure that you track that down as at Bayou Blitz Pod. And folks, if you are already members of any or all of those groups, we thank you and we love you for your support. Continue to boost this. We say it every week. This is your show. This is the Bayou Blitz family. So promote it to your family. Promote it to your friends. Promote it to other Saints fans. Shove it down the throats of fans of other teams. Make us known. Make your show a worldwide force.
Absolutely. For myself, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at BT Boylan. Follow all my work with the Saints News Network, mostly fantasy stuff, and we'll get to that. It's about that time of year. It'll be fun. Follow it all there. I have to thank you guys, too, because I noticed it over the last couple weeks when it comes to our weekly Twitter polls on what you guys want us to talk about. Votes have gone up every week, so we appreciate you.
Yes.
And the more votes, the better, because we get to hear from all of you on what you guys want us to talk about. We hope we got the best in-depth analysis of the Gardner-Johnson trade that you have heard or read so far. I think Bob did a fantastic job with that. And until next week, we say thank you. We say, remember, real football is right around the corner. And that means we get to see real Angry Bob, one of my favorite parts of every new season. And hopefully we'll see a ton of you throughout the year as well. That's it for the Bayou Blitz tonight. As always, find your peace, spread love, practice positivity. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place, Bayou Blitz Podcast.